Hi there. So this is Saurav. So today's tutorial is going to be on, does a Bitcoin transaction really take a lot of time? So let's uh, let's talk about it. So there you go. So there's my slide. So um, safe harbors. So now let's get in. So let's understand what is a Bitcoin transaction. So you got to understand that it's a digital currency. So obviously, it doesn't have any physical presence. So what happens when a transaction comes in? That transaction actually uses an existing ledger on the blockchain platform, which needs to be verified and authenticated by the miners. Now, that ledger is secure, but it is obviously public. So don't fret. They try and verify the transaction using something called a public key. And once the transaction is verified, they stamp on it. So that's a verified signature, which authenticates the transaction and creates a new block, which gets added to the entire ledger. So private keys are actually never shared. So there are actually two kinds of keys. There's a public key and a private key. So the private keys are never shared, and they remain with the investor. But the public key is shared, and that is what is used by the miners to actually authenticate the transaction. Now, when I say that the private keys are not shared, but scams do exist, so be mindful of that. So those private keys are used by the investor to initiate and authorize a transaction, which either a buy or a sell. Now, what are private and public keys? So private keys are those which, like I said, remain with the investors. It is never shared unless the investor wants to share. And it is, as you understand, it's used to initiate and authorize a transaction, whether it's a buy or a sell transaction of Bitcoins. Public key contains three kinds of data. So one is the input data. So input data essentially talks about all the history behind the coin that you're transacting. So in this case, it's a Bitcoin. So all the previous transaction that has gone through the source and all of that. The second piece is the amount. So how many Bitcoins are being transacted in that particular transaction? That's the amount. And the output is actually the destination or the target of the transaction, which is the private key. So, but private key never gets revealed. So the transaction has to end somewhere, has to go somewhere and get deposited as a block. So essentially, so with that, that closes the transaction. So that's the output. Now, the public key provides all the information with regards to the transaction. And there are so only after the blockchain receives all these three different key data can a miner start to validate and verify the transaction. Without any one of them, the miner will not be able to verify and validate the transaction. Now, how much time does it take to actually transfer a Bitcoin? Well, it takes 10 minutes, it takes an hour, 2 days, a week. Well, there is no straight answer to that. It really depends upon a couple of factors. But you need to understand the transactions need to be added to the block. So unless they are added to the block, the transaction is never complete. Now there are two elements that play a role in determining how long the transaction will take. So there is something called a network activity. I think a lot of you would know, and there's something called a transaction fee. So now let's talk about these two individually. Network activity. So obviously, higher the network activity, more the number of transactions. So the higher the network activity is directly proportional to the number of transactions. So if there are many transactions that are happening, obviously the network will be highly active and it will take more time. Now, you also have to be mindful that the miners are limited in numbers. So there aren't too many miners, and they process Bitcoin transaction per 1 MB block. So all transactions, so I had mentioned in my previous tutorial that there's a queue which is which the transaction comes into a queue which is called a mempool. So they gather all the transactions get gathered in the pool, and the size of the mempool actually depends on three factors. So one is waiting time. So how much time it is your transaction is waiting, how important is your transaction, so there's transaction priority, and how much you're paying for that transaction, so transaction fees. So you would also receive a series of confirmations when the transaction is happening. So one confirmation may not mean the transaction is complete. So you will have to ensure that the block is created, and only then the transaction is complete. The second point is actually the transaction fees. Now, Bitcoin transactions are usually expressed in Satoshi per byte. So, Satoshi Nakamoto was that elusive character was the guy who supposedly created Bitcoins back in 2009. So a Satoshi per byte means it's the 100 millionth of a Bitcoin per byte size of the transaction. So it's really small. So that's the reason why every block, like I mentioned before, is a 1 MB. 1 MB. So now, is it really mandatory to pay a fee for the transaction? Actually not. It's not. But if you don't pay the transaction fee, the miners will take their own sweet time to authorize a transaction, and hence they will keep it for the last. So one of the factors of the transaction to be higher or earlier on the mempool queue is the fee that you have decided to pay to the miners to verify your transaction. So now you have to also be mindful that Bitcoin is a decentralized currency. Obviously, that means that it's highly volatile. So if the transaction takes too long time, you may potentially lose, probably even make a lot of money. So wait time of over 30 minutes can actually be critical or catastrophic for you. So you need to be conscious of that element before you decide to whether pay a fee and a fee to the miner or not to pay a fee, or if you decide to pay, how much you want to pay to the miner. Now, the completion of a transaction actually is done when the miner has processed the block which contains your transaction. Now, of course, on top of the transaction fee that you pay to the miner, there could be a nominal fee that the exchanges might charge you because they have to ensure that your transaction is processed within a particular timeline, because there are multiple thousands and millions of transactions waiting behind your transaction. Now, typically, one confirmation is enough for a transaction under $1,000, but you need about 6 confirmations if your transaction is over $1,000 to about $1 million. And you need 60 confirmations if your transaction is over $1 million, because the more the number of confirmations, the more authenticate, more safe and secure your transaction becomes, and hence it is extremely critical that you have more and more confirmations for your transactions. So that's pretty much what I had to tell you about how long it takes to complete a Bitcoin transaction. So As you know, my name is Saurav Mukherjee. I'm a digital technology marketing leader with over 20 years of global experience. I will leave behind my LinkedIn URL in the description below. Please feel free to connect with me. You can also get a free copy of this tutorial if you subscribe to my newsletter, which is a link to that will be there in the description below as well. I work as a consultant with many companies and startups. You can engage me. So to do that, you can just check yes on the third field of the form of subscription form, and I shall reach out to you on an email. So that's it, guys. I will be back with more videos soon. So next one will probably be a product review, and then I will go back to my tutorials from Monday. So you all of you have a great weekend and take care. Bye bye.